thanks for coming today, everybody. Today's a PFF webinar, Avoiding Classism in the Classroom, Creating Courses Without Great Cost. So we're going to be talking about how to support your lower middle, low income students in academia. As an educator, what you can do to help them learn, feel comfortable, feel welcomed, etc. I'm going to start with some brief introductions. So hello, everybody. My name is Holly, or Holly Eva. I'm your host today. I am a PFF fellow. I am an English major. I've been at CGU a few years now. I'm matriculated from the MA to the PhD program, and some of my foci in pedagogy related to academia include accessibility and inclusion. And I'm going to go ahead and give my co-host Jessie a moment to go ahead and introduce herself.
Hey everybody, I'm Jessie Knipple. I am also a PFF fellow, and I am a PhD student in the religion department. I'm in the gender studies and religion track, and I also do gender studies and media. And this is Coltrane.
All right, thanks for that, Jessie. So now I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I know one or two people came after I originally started talking, but if you do have to leave early for any reason, if you have some other commitments, an emergency, etc., the slides have been linked in the chat, a link to the slides. As well, if you missed that link somehow, the slides will be available via a link on the PFF events page. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So first, just a brief note about this webinar, what it's going to cover. This webinar will cover the concept of classism and how educators can avoid enforcing classism in the classroom. This includes creating classes with low cost to students, diversifying course material and foci, avoiding possibly classist course rules or regulations, and withholding classist judgments. I will say the majority of this is a little bit more focused on creating classes with low cost to students and giving examples of how classism appears in academia in the classroom. All right, so first, just briefly, and some of you may already be familiar with this. If you're attending this webinar, you may already know what classism is. You may already have an interest in this, but just for those who may want, sort of a review, or for those who may not know, I'm just going to briefly give a definition of class. This is from an article on class and classism. Quote, social class is a series of relationships. A person's social class is defined here by the way that a person relates to the process in society by which goods, services, and culture are produced. One relates to several aspects of the production process primarily through one's work. One is a relationship to the system of ownership, to other people at work in society, and to the process of one's own productive activity. One's relationship to all three of these aspects of production determines one's social class. That is, all three relationships are necessary and none is sufficient for determining a person's relationship to the process of product. So class is a little bit complicated. It's not just how much you own. It is also related to what place you hold in society, what you produce, etc. So it is a little bit complicated. Class is not always so obvious, is basically the point of me inserting this slide here, that someone may not belong to the social class that you think they do. They may have more or less funds or ability than it seems from the outside. So not always so obvious a marker. And so now that we've covered class, just briefly, what is classism? So a sort of brief overview definition: classism is a judgment or system of judgments based on one's class or perceived class. A more accurate definition, or at least the Merriam-Webster definition, is a belief that a person's social or economic station in society determines their value in that society. All right, so before we actually get started into some of the ways that you can avoid classism in the classroom, how classism appears in the classroom, I want to have a brief reflection. In this reflection, you can take a couple minutes to think and form your ideas before we share, and then you will be able to share optionally. You do not need to feel pressured to. But briefly, I want to ask, with the definition of class and classism now in mind, try to think of a time that you experienced or witnessed classism take place in a classroom or in another academic setting. So these are just a few examples to sort of get you thinking. People may think, oh, well, it doesn't really happen to me, or, maybe you think, oh, well, I'm, pretty well off, or I'm from this such and such background, so it doesn't happen to me. But there's just a couple examples to maybe get your mind jogging. So first, were you or another student shamed for having to rent a textbook as opposed to, buying one? Did you ever have to skip out on a field trip or similar event? The implication here is due to cost, maybe transportation issues, etc. And another example, did you have trouble making it to class due to transportation issues that you were then shamed for? So those are just a couple examples. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to just think, so we're not quite sharing yet. And then I'll go ahead and prompt you after a few minutes pass. Okay, so just briefly, before we get started with sharing, I did just want to say that I know that I introduced myself and that Jessie introduced herself as host and co-host, but I do want to say that there are 2 other PFF fellows here. One is Jonathan, the other Noah, so they're also going to be active in the chat. You can also interact with them. They both are PFF fellows and also host webinars. So I just wanted to add that. I believe they're the only other 2 PFF fellows currently here. And I do already see some activity in chat. Leslie, you're raising your hand. Go ahead and share if you'd like.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. The very first thing that popped into my mind is something that I think about a lot. It was from when I was in high school, which was a long time ago. I won't reveal the year to protect myself, but it was a long time ago, and I still remember it very clearly. So in high school, there were a group of other students who were in my sports team, and they wanted to have an event and a celebratory event. Just to get together at the end of the sports season and celebrate our accomplishments, which is not unreasonable. But they were talking about doing more and more extravagant things and steak dinner and, booking a venue for it. And at the time, my parents, who were both in the Army and had just recently retired, were struggling financially, and that was a big thing in our home, is talking a lot about money problems and the stress that resulted. And I remember just having a blow up when one of my best friends was talking about, we'll rent this venue and they have great food and we can do all these things. And I just remember saying, not all of us are in that position where we can do it, and I don't want to miss out. And I just kind of remembered, imploding a little bit from the stress and the expectations, and not having access to the same resources as other families.
Okay, thank you for sharing. Definitely, that's another good example. Well, maybe good is not the right word, but I think you understand what I mean, where, a student is in a situation where they maybe don't have access to the same things as other people because those people either have additional funds, additional resources, etc. So those are all good things to think about moving forward. It's good to kind of keep in mind that you may have had these experiences. And I think that's really good to consider when moving forward as, wanting to be an educator, wanting to work in faculty or somewhere in academia, because if you have had those experiences, if they've made you uncomfortable, feel unwelcomed, you can kind of better prioritize the feelings of students, the feelings of other people in academia, because obviously you don't want them to feel the way that you may feel or have experienced those things. So let's go ahead and move forward. Thank you to everyone who shared. All right. So these are just examples specific to now. So if you had trouble thinking of any instances where you may have experienced classism in, elementary or primary school, in high school, junior college, et cetera, maybe there are some examples that may be more recent. So these are examples that may be unique to graduate school. So the first example is judgment for attending less conferences than others, an assumption that this is due to laziness. So conferences, of course, if you're familiar, if you've ever been to a conference, if you've tried to apply to a conference, commonly they require you to pay admissions or application fees. Sometimes they require you to have a membership in a particular institution. So for example, you may have to be a member of MLA or another institution in order to actually present at that conference. And typically those membership fees or those admission fees can be quite expensive. So people may assume that you're not serious about your career, that you're not serious about academia if you don't attend a certain number of conferences per year, whatever that number may be. However, of course, they are costly, and they do also sometimes, depending on if they're not virtual, they may also require transportation costs and other costs besides the admission fees. And I do see there was another example in chat. Thank you for sharing that example as well. Next, the expectation that you should own a car and be able to access certain research facilities or collections. So for example, if you're attending CGU, you may have heard before, depending on what you study, what you're looking into, that the Huntington or other similar local collections are something that you should visit for your research, that you should be active in, that you can attempt to get involved with other researchers there, network there, etc. Of course, if you do have trouble with transportation, which is related to class, your ability to obtain a vehicle or have money for transportation, then that can be quite difficult for you. And finally, the last example that I have here, a lack of resources for first generation college students or graduate students. So, perhaps your parents did not attend college at all. Perhaps they have a bachelor's degree, but if no one in your family has attended graduate school or graduated from graduate school before, you may have entered graduate school like myself and not have even heard of conferences. I didn't even know what they were. So this is also related to class. Typically someone in, upper middle class or someone from higher classes with more resources is more likely to have had family members that could afford to attend graduate school as well. So those individuals are starting with a little bit of a head start because they already have some frame of reference for what happens in graduate school, what's expected of you in graduate school. So that's also an obvious way that class is divided in graduate school, is whether or not any family members or friends have attended graduate school and whether or not you have any kind of frame of reference or knowledge of graduate school starting out. All right. And in general, besides just graduate school, besides our personal examples, how can classism appear in the classroom? So first, the setup of a traditional classroom in academia corresponds, quote, closely to the social relations of dominance, subordination, and motivation in the economic sphere. This is a quote from an article that discusses classism in academia specifically. It will be listed towards the end of the slides. There's going to be a list of references or works cited. So those would be good articles to check out if you're interested in looking further into this. But essentially, the idea that there's this power dynamic between a professor and the students, even the typical physical class layout, does already set up or ready the class for examples of classism, because you're already creating this hierarchy or structure. So it's easy for classist judgments to sort of slip in with this sort of structure. Second, costly required textbooks and materials. So this, unfortunately, in our current academic system is pretty common. Students may get financial aid, they may not for various reasons, but typically textbooks and materials, lab fees, things like that can be quite expensive, and that's a cause for classist divisions. Next, syllabi that include dress codes. So this is a less apparent and maybe less commonly discussed issue, but some professors, whether it be in junior college, graduate school, et cetera, they may include a dress code, and commonly those dress codes can ask you to dress professionally, dress a particular way. And of course, clothing costs money. You may not already have, professional wear, so that can put you at a disadvantage. And in addition, I know that I did bring up conferences previously, but professional wear is another cost that can be associated with conferences as well, since it is typically expected that you dress professionally. Strict and inflexible attendance policies are actually also an enforcer of a classist divide between students, primarily because a very strict, very inflexible attendance policy doesn't allow for students that perhaps have to work multiple jobs, work jobs with a shifting schedule. It does not allow them to miss due to work responsibilities. So when you're looking at students that perhaps their family, they come from a family with a lot of wealth, or they come from a family that at least has enough of a foundation to support them and make it so they do not have to work, they probably, excluding extraneous variables such as disability and chronic illness, they may not need such a flexible attendance policy. So that does create a classist divide if a professor is not willing to hear out a student on reasons that they may be absent, allow for some leeway, etc. Next, field trips and events that require payment or costly transportation, which has been briefly mentioned previously, and not properly prioritizing financial aid when passing on information to students. So in a syllabus, you typically have a list of resources. I'm sure you've all seen this before, where a professor will list, for example, at CGU, perhaps the Writing Center, Career Development Office, PFF, etc. They may list things like that. They may or may not. But listing financial aid information and opportunities in a syllabus, or for example, if you're a professor that gives announcements before class, those are all good times to include financial aid information, additional scholarship resources or information that you may have heard of. So if a professor does not think that's important, if they think, oh, well, the institution's already reaching out to them about financial aid, so I don't need to do that, that sort of leans towards prioritizing those students who don't need financial aid, right? So that's always important to consider. And now we have some hyper-specific classist judgments in academia. These are all related to the previous ways that classism can appear in academia. So for example, we already discussed that having a dress code in your syllabus can create classist divides. It can lead to giving preference to students who already can afford professional wear, already own professional wear. So that correlates to the first example here, that one's clothing is an indicator of one's dedication or professionalism. This is an assumption that's very widespread. So a professor may assume if you come to class and you're wearing, a button up, a sport coat, something nice, right? Then they may assume that you care more, that you put in more effort, right? And that can be problematic for a few other reasons, because of course, if you're someone who is disabled or chronically ill, you may not have the space or energy to get dressed, but it also speaks right to your budget. Second, if a student does not purchase the optional text from the syllabus, then they do not care about the course as much. So sometimes a professor on their syllabus will have required readings, and then they'll have optional readings. Sometimes those optional readings, especially they will not be accessible for free. And sometimes I've noticed that's why a professor will put those readings as optional, because they don't want to require a reading that a student cannot obtain for free from either the library, whether that's the institution's library or a public library, something else. So they'll list it as optional. They don't want to have a required reading that they can't access for free. Of course, the issue can then be that you want to make sure that professor or yourself is not making the assumption that the students that do get those optional texts, that automatically means that they care more about the particular class, the particular research than other people. Okay. And a student that dedicates all their time to school and does not work a menial labor, retail, food service, etc. job is one that cares more about their education. So this I have heard instructors, professors, teachers say that, you know, if you, you know, don't work, you're spending more time on class, you're focusing more on, you know, conferences, you're focusing more on your academic ventures, you know, whether that is student government or just actual essay writing, publishing, etc. This can be an issue because it can lead to the assumption that those who really care about their education aren't going to work, or they're going to do everything in their power to avoid working, especially jobs that are not considered related to academia or related to their research interests. And of course, those jobs are very limited. And the ability to not work in graduate school is definitely a privilege that not many people have. So that can be a big issue. And finally, a student who comes to office hours regularly is clearly more interested in their education and networking / forming relationships than those who do not. So a professor may have certain office hours. If they're not flexible in those office hours, that doesn't give other students the opportunity to attend. Perhaps they have work, perhaps they have, you know, child care or other care responsibilities. They may have things that perhaps a student who is more well off wouldn't, you know, have those responsibilities. So it can be an issue to assume that students who care more about the class will always come to office hours, particularly if you're not flexible in scheduling custom office hours with students, then that can definitely be an issue. All right. And just briefly, I want to talk about undergraduate institutions. We did cover graduate institutions as far as conferences and things are concerned, but the undergraduate experience can be very different and it has other costs. So briefly, just some examples of classism that can be specific to undergraduate institutions. The first example is sororities and fraternities charge fees and often require a wealth of clothing options for various scenarios, events. I actually did not know this until I became an undergraduate at a UC where there were sororities and fraternities, and I lived right on a sorority or fraternity row, not in a sorority or fraternity building, obviously, but just right next to them. I was not aware that sororities and fraternities charged fees, but they do charge annual fees. Typically, they also charge fees for events of different kinds, and they do require you to have a big wardrobe because they have formal events, they have casual events, they have beach events. So if you were interested in getting involved with a sorority or fraternity, chances are that would be an added expense. So definitely, sororities and fraternities tended, at least in my experience, to be made up of people that had more wealth or that, you know, did not have as many work responsibilities also, because that led to them having the time to get involved, obviously. Next, various extracurriculars may charge fees or require expensive supplies. So various clubs, various sports, you can at times get financial aid to cover those endeavors, but it really depends on the organization. It really depends on the institution you're attending. So students typically have more opportunities if they have more funds to get involved in those extracurricular activities. Next, schools and academic competitions charging application fees. So just to get into an undergraduate institution, you obviously have to apply. Also getting involved in different academic competitions or even sports sometimes. There are sometimes application fees for all those things. And while you can at times get them written off or reduced, sometimes you can't. And even when they're reduced, sometimes that expense can still be quite big, so quite great. And lastly, you want to be aware of stigma that may be associated with, one moment. Sorry, I'm having trouble actually. Let's see, there's also pressure to join professional associations that have fees, additional certs and trainings. This is true. Professional associations, especially sometimes undergraduate institutions have professional organizations, not so much clubs, but professional organizations for different career paths. And those can also charge fees. That's a really good point. Thank you, Jonathan. Also stigma against transfer students, students that attend junior colleges. Typically junior colleges are cheaper. There are various grants and things that enable students to attend these institutions for less cost, but maybe some of you are aware, maybe some of you experienced this. Sometimes undergraduate institutions can have either students or professors that have a little bit of a stigma against transfer students, thinking either that they're not as serious, that they didn't do well in high school, and that's why they had to attend a junior college. These are all things you want to be aware of. So if you become an instructor or an educator, faculty member at a junior college, you want to be aware that these stigmas might exist for students moving forward. You may want to make them aware of that unfortunate fact. And then if you work at an undergraduate institution, of course, you want to be sure to support your transfer students. And so next, I want to just really briefly cover, what does really any of this mean? I mean, what does classism in higher ed, in college, what does it really do to students? Does it have an effect? And this is a quote that references multiple studies. Again, this will be in the works cited, but I highly recommend this article in particular. And this quote reads, "Students from working class backgrounds clearly see disparities based on class differences, express sensitivity to social class issues, and believe that social class matters in their collegiate experience. Working class students clearly articulate their astute awareness of social class by identifying cultural rules and symbols associated with various levels of social class." Aries and Snyder discovered that low-income students attending a private college reported greater feelings of inadequacy, intimidation, exclusion, and inferiority than their peers. So clearly this has an effect. It primarily has an emotional effect, a motivational effect, where students will feel less successful. They'll feel like they have less ability to do things. They're less likely to get involved for fear of that stigma, and it can affect their grades. So classism in higher ed is something you want to be aware of and something you want to combat, because it does have an effect on students. All right, so these are some brief examples of ways that you can help as an educator, that you can try and mitigate this. So I have two categories here: what you can do in relation to your syllabus setup and things you can do beyond your syllabus. So firstly, as far as things you can do in your syllabus, consider including a list of free and affordable student resources offered by the institution in question that you're working with or working for, especially concerning technology. So typically an institution will provide you, sometimes at least, with a sort of template for a syllabus, and it will list, these are the student resources you should consider including. That'll typically include any type of tutoring centers, writing centers, etc. But sometimes it may not include, free computer usage. It may not include free online resources, especially ones that are not associated with the institution in question. So it's always good to do a little bit of research and list as many free and affordable resources for students as you possibly can. If it was an in-person class and you don't want to include it in a printed syllabus, because especially we're talking about free online resources, you could make the students aware that you would email them a separate document, a separate email with all kinds of links to free resources. Next, and I've already covered this, but you want to include a flexible attendance policy for reasons we've already covered, forego a dress code or professionalism statement for the same reason that we've already covered, that they can inhibit students that have less of a wardrobe. Finally, along with your office hours, include a statement noting that you can meet at appointments outside these hours for those with a need. So this one's really important. As I've already discussed, having very limited office hours, only, between a certain window once a week, can really limit who's able to come and discuss their concerns with you. So just be open and make students aware that you're open to meeting with them, either on person, in Zoom, whatever you're willing to do, at other times. When possible, do not require texts that are costly or cannot be accessed for free. So it is always best to require texts, have your required textbooks be things that the students can either access through a public library, through the institution's library, especially ones that have many copies available, or have an ebook, even maybe an audiobook available for those students that prefer, accessing text that way. Now, I do understand that depending on the course you're teaching, depending on your level of experience with the institution in particular, you may or may not be allowed to pick your own textbook. Oftentimes, if you're teaching something like Math 100, Math 300, if you're teaching certain history classes, you may be told what textbook you have to use. So the institution may not give you a choice. It really depends on the subject you're teaching and the class you're teaching, your level of experience. Obviously, in those cases, you're not picking the textbook, but you can do some research on whether or not the textbook can be accessed either through the institution's library. Sometimes students are allowed to make copies depending on the institution, the textbook in question, or through outside libraries. Even if the library of your institution does not have that textbook, always check outside libraries and online article sources, because sometimes you can find things for free there that you can't find elsewhere. And where relevant, consider the class diversity of lessons and required readings. This one is very niche. It's not applicable to all subjects, but if you're teaching a subject that, for example, let's say English literature, or maybe an art history class, something that covers multiple novels or multiple shorter books, multiple artists, writers, etc. Consider including works that come from a diverse class background so that they're not all upper class individuals. Just to add some diversity. This does, of course, depend, because again, this is not going to be applicable to all subjects. And now, what can you do outside of your syllabus? Maybe your syllabus has a whole host of free and affordable items listed. Maybe you forego a dress code. And of course, that will also depend on the institution, if the institution allows it. But what can you do beyond the syllabus? So first, you can familiarize yourself with any student unions at the institution, as well as whether or not there is a student bill of rights in place. And this particularly ties back to a lot of other points. If there is a student bill of rights in place, it's good to familiarize yourself with what it includes, because it may include certain statements that will help support students from, lower middle or lower class, lower income households, so that you can be aware of what kind of resources and rights exists in place for them. And if there's not a student bill of rights, depending on the institution, depending on how long you've been there, you may be able to support, for example, a constitution committee, a particular student union or student government, as a sitting-in professor or as a faculty support member, depending on the structure of that institution. And that will allow you to prompt the idea of a student bill of rights. Of course, as a faculty member or as an educator, you want the students to have their own voice. So even if you do encourage them to start their own student bill of rights, of course, you would preferably want them to come up with their own interests for the student bill of rights, perhaps vote on what should be included, but just sort of checking on whether or not there is a student bill of rights, prompting them to get involved will sometimes help support in different ways students from lower class backgrounds. And just as a quick example of how that can actually work out, a student bill of rights can include things like saying, we reserve the right to dress how we want, so long as we are wearing clothing, we should be able to wear clothing that is casual and comfortable, particularly if we are students that are disabled, have chronic illnesses, etc. So that can sort of affect the actual institution, the policies, of that institution, because if the students are requesting that in their Bill of Rights, typically something like that will be amended in the institution's policies. And as we already explained, a dress code can be inhibitive to lower class students. So that is just one example of how a student Bill of Rights is very actionable, can make changes in the institution to help students of different classes. Next, consider sharing information related to conferences, events, etc., with students, especially when said events are local or virtual. So oftentimes, again, this is less common, I would say, for junior college, but for undergraduate and graduate students, typically they are encouraged to attend conferences, to attend events, to look for calls for papers, depending on your major, maybe competitions of various sorts. And oftentimes they may hear that they should be pursuing that, but sometimes the institution has absolutely no support for disseminating information on, calls for papers, call for conference proposals, etc. So as an instructor, it's always good to keep in mind that if you are someone who gives before class announcements or updates, if you send out emails to your students every now and then, you may want to include any calls for papers or conference requests that you come across. especially if they are relevant to the grade level of students that you're teaching, just because sometimes, like I said, there's no support network for that. All right, and I am listing briefly, I'm not going to go through every single one, so you don't have to worry about that. I'm just listing some free online resources for students, and these are going to be obviously in the slides, but I'm also going to go ahead and paste in the chat a Google Doc that has these free online resources listed and also more free online resources, more than I'm going to have in the slides, just because I didn't want to overwhelm them, that you may want to share with your students. Again, this depends on what type of class you're teaching, the level of students you're teaching, but some of these are relevant for pretty much all students, such as School Track. It's a free online school planner where you can sort of set in your courses, your due dates, etc. There are paid versions of this, but it's always good to know that there are free versions out there for students that need it. Things like Canva and Prezi that allow students to present. Maybe they don't have PowerPoint. Maybe they couldn't afford the full, complete Office package, or maybe they simply don't like it. So that's always good to know about. Plagiarism detector is a big one because students from low-income households, from households who do not contain other family members or friends that attended college or, got a degree, they may not be aware of what plagiarism even is. Most plagiarism is accidental. And if a student is not educated on what plagiarism is, they may not even be aware that their paper contains plagiarism, and they could possibly get kicked out of school or encounter some negative effects of accidentally plagiarizing. So things like a free plagiarism detector would be important and good to know about. I'm also including the UPenn call for papers page, which lists calls for papers, conferences, etc., for students that want to get involved in that sort of thing. That's a really good resource that oftentimes students are not told about. They're not informed. Citation Machine. There are many things like Purdue OWL and Citation Machine, EasyBib, etc., that all help them, that will help students, create citations for works cited pages. Those are really good to tell students about. And then just a few more. There are a few resources included here in regards to finding references like works cited, articles for papers. And that can be really useful for students who do not have time to visit the library in person, or students who do not have, transportation to be able to go to the library very frequently. Online search engines for references can be very useful for them. And sometimes an institution may have their own library, of course, and their own reference searching database, but it may not include everything that outside ones do. So that's always good to know about. And there are a few study aids here. And also Books Counter is good to tell your students about because that enables them to buy and sell textbooks for the lowest cost. It's essentially a type of search engine that will compare prices for selling and buying books across different sites. So especially if you are requiring them to buy materials, if maybe you're forced to use a particular textbook that is not free, that's a good option for them as well. And I do see a comment in the chat from Jesse who says a lot of conferences do have student scholarships. And that's a good thing to inform them about as well. If you are directing your students to conferences, to events, be aware of how accessible that event really is for low-income students. Do they offer some kind of admissions fee waiver, some kind of scholarship? Do they have some type of award money even? That's always good to inform your students because that may affect their decision on whether or not they think they're able to get involved with those types of things. So thank you for that comment, Jesse. All right, and now I have another reflection. So this is related to all of the free resources that I just listed. And again, those are going to be present in that Google Doc. So I'd like to ask you to briefly consider the types of resources and pieces of information that may be valuable to students who are low or lower middle class, basically low income students. Such resources should ideally be free or at least affordable. If you can think of any resources like this that have not yet been named on either of the two previous slides, please share now if you're comfortable doing so. So if any of you know of a particular resource that you think is great for students, go ahead and raise your hand, share out loud, share in the chat. And if you share it in the chat, I'll just go ahead and read it out loud for you.
I remember a college once did like a workshop on how to get like a suit for cheaper. They would teach students how to like get discount suits, and then provided them like a community resource that would help them with getting those tailored instead of having to go out and buy the expensive suits. Of course, now, dress is not as big of a deal, but some business students might still need something like that.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. That's really interesting. I've never heard of an institution doing that, but I think that's great. And I think also your comment about, for some business students, it might matter. That is also a really good point. Even with CGU, I've encountered this because I'm an English major. And even though most of my professors at CGU have included in their syllabi different types of dress codes, I've never really had a professor be ultra strict about it, if that makes sense. But I have heard from friends who are business students that that are studying business or management, that those classes or that particular structure can be really more picky about the wardrobe of their students. And I know I've heard business programs other places can be that way as well. Also, I think law can sometimes be that way. So it may depend on your major, but I think that's a really great idea. So if you are working for a particular institution, researching any type of resources like that, how to get formal wear cheaper would also be a great thing to include. Thank you for sharing that. And I do see in the chat, Jesse says food pantries and food insecurity support, tax support, refurbished technology resources. Yeah, those are all great things. Some institutions I've noticed, especially I've noticed junior colleges will include like nearby food pantries and food support of different types in their resources page for students, even if it's not associated with the institution. But from what I've noticed, at least, sometimes the sort of upper higher ed, especially private schools, won't include that information on their resources page. So clearly there's a little bit of a divide there, but whether or not the institution includes it on their resources page, that is always a great thing to include, because for one of the works cited actually that I was using to sort of form some quotes and things for this webinar, I did see a statistic that something like 30 to 40, it was in between 30 and 40% of students don't have enough to eat on a regular basis, or that they struggle with food security of some kind. So that is a great thing to include in your syllabus to let students know about. Any resources related to refurbishing technology, that's always great to include. And in fact, for CGU, for example, I just literally earlier this morning during a meeting heard that the financial aid department here at CGU allows you to contact them or fill out some type of form related to technology costs, where if your computer breaks down, you have to buy a new one, or, maybe you have to buy a computer part to replace it, something like that, because that is something that is necessary for Canvas and for basically attending classes or doing homework, writing papers, etc. That the financial aid department, you can fill out an application to possibly have them increase your aid or cover that. And I was not aware of that at all.
For medical expenses, Holly. So there's a list of things that you can bump up your aid each term if you have medical costs that are unexpected, car costs, childcare costs, or technology costs. And I know because I've had to use that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I did hear that as well just this morning when I was talking about it. When I heard this from somebody, they mentioned, if you have to get eyeglasses, that sort of thing. So just like you were saying, medical costs, things like that. And I was not aware of this. So, And that's not to say that CGU doesn't tell students in some way. Maybe I missed an email, or maybe I just wasn't at some part of orientation where it was that information was disseminated. But that is something to consider, is even if your institution does tell students that you have these support networks, that student might have missed an orientation, or they might have overlooked a newsletter. Like, they might still have missed that information, even if it was disseminated. So whether or not you think information is readily available, always provide it to students. Let's see some comments. Free Metro bus passes. Jesse noted that CGU just sent out emails about that this week. So yeah, if there's any kind of transportation support, sometimes junior colleges, your student pass counts as like free bus passes in your county. Always research that and let people know whether or not that's something that there's a support network for. So all really good points. Thank you for sharing all those. Those are all great. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to add?
There's also often like an emergency fund that students can apply through student councils. If you have something that comes up that's an emergency, it's usually under $500 emergencies. And then our student council, I know at CGU also, you can apply for travel funds or research funds or conference funds. And those, I think those max out. Jonathan, do you know, it's like $2,000 or $3,000 they max out for your whole time there, but that's another resource that's available.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. That is true. You can apply for, at CGU specifically, but also at other institutions, be aware if they have any kind of conference travel support, grants, research support. At CGU specifically, there is a TMA award, which is like travel and materials award for conferences specifically. And I will say that previously, this past semester, I assisted with, looking through the applications for TMA awards, since I'm involved with student government. And we had to go on social media and ask people to apply again, like multiple times. And we had to extend the deadline because not enough people applied. So clearly students either just weren't getting that information or they didn't think they qualified. But, as an instructor, always be aware of what type of awards or grants or support exists at your institution, because a lot of the time students will not be aware and they won't take advantage of what is there for them. All right. All right, so I did list the Google Doc here. If you wanted to look at all the free online student resources listed, again, there's more there than is actually in the slides. So like free, even like online, like fitness courses, meditation, libraries, research opportunities, etc. And then also I did briefly just want to say thank you for attending, but before you leave, if you wouldn't mind taking this poll, let's see here. So the link tree has links to all of those in the slides. So if you miss one in the chat, if you don't get one, then you can always go back to the slides. Like I said, they are on the PFF events page online, so you can access those. All right. And before I close out, did anyone have any other comments? Oh, yes. Leslie, I see you for hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a technical question. I went on the PFF website and it doesn't immediately allow access to the slides. You have to ask permission. So I just wanted to make sure that if we ask permission, there's nothing else we need to do to get access to the slides.
I'll change the permission right now.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah,
Thank you.
So that should be automatic after that. Sorry about that. All right, and I'll just give a moment in case anyone has any other comments, any questions about anything, any examples they wanted to share, etc.
I'll add just an observation that I could be wrong, and I often am, but it just seems to me that community colleges do a really good job of providing a lot of inclusive resources for students. And it just seems as though the higher you get, university, and then graduate schools and so forth, that provide less and less information about the resources that are available. And so I think that, this really great webinar that Holly's put together is just a reminder for us as educators that you know, we do have to step in and fill in those gaps where the resources are sort of lacking.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate that. And I've noticed that as well. You know, I can't speak to whether or not it's a statistical fact, you know, whether or not there's numbers behind it. It'd be interesting to see if there is, but just from personal, like anecdotal evidence, I've also noticed that. I personally went to junior college before transferring to a UC. And I felt that the junior college I went to was extremely supportive. I mean, they put up flyers, they sent out emails, they would disseminate information on all of their resources and outside resources multiple ways. And then attending a UC, which of course a UC, you know, it is a state school, it's not private, but it definitely had a lot more students that came from wealthier backgrounds compared maybe to some other schools. And there was definitely a night and day difference as far as what information was being given. More information, at least in my experience at the UC, was being given about, you know, clubs and events that would actually cost money, but not so much about resources. So yeah, I wonder if there are some numbers behind that. So, and then I do see someone says, yes, I agree. So, you know, that's all anecdotal events, but maybe there are some numbers behind that. And then Jesse says the poll's going to close out in 30 seconds. That may have already passed, actually. So thank you to those who were able to take the poll. Did anybody else have any questions or comments or anything they wanted to share? It's always good to, you know, when you have, if you're an instructor and you set up something like that, especially if you're involved with something like that, you know, keep that in mind, you know, how inclusive or how welcoming everything is to all students. So yeah, thank you for noting that. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. So that concludes the webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. Again, all the slides are going to be online on the PFF website. And that concludes today's webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. If anybody has any questions or comments that they want to be outside the recording, you can do so right afterwards.